Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 78, a history of Israel's failures and God's faithfulness. Before we go any further, I just want to notice that there are a number of these Psalms, starting actually with the last one, Psalm 77, that are described as Psalms of devastation and deliverance. So that Psalm 77, what we looked at last time, was a plea to God who has shown power in the past, and the implication is and we need some power in the present. And now 78, we're going to see the history of God saving His people, and also their lack of faith in that situation, in those various situations. Psalm 79 is going to describe the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon and have a plea for God to forgive and to restore his people. Psalm 80 will be about the fall of Samaria at the hands of the Assyrians. So these are not given in chronological order. That actually happens before the events described in Psalm 79. Next, in Psalm 81, we have the return to God who was faithful in bringing Israel out of Egypt. We have Psalm 82, a plea for God to judge the earth and to rescue the weak and the needy. And finally, Psalm 83, a plea for God to judge the enemies of Israel who have invaded. So all of these are set in the circumstances of devastation and or deliverance, and hopefully both in most of those. With that, we begin our superscription. It's a very short one, a maskil of Asaph. That term maskil we've seen before. There's the Hebrew, it's from the root uh, sakal, to instruct. But then the psalm begins, listen, O my people, to my instruction. Now, that's not the same word. This time it's our old friend Torah, which can mean either law or, in this case, instruction. I think works better, especially when we take it with the next line, incline your ears to the words of my mouth. So this is just general instruction, not necessarily taken from the Torah itself, or not even just law, but instruction. And then verse 2, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old. That's two ways of describing the same thing, a parable and a parable or dark sayings. In other words, difficult sayings. Verse 3, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. So we're starting with sort of an introduction, which is going to continue for a number of verses. Verse 4, we will not conceal them from their children, that is, these instructions, these dark sayings, but tell to the generation to come the praises of the Lord. Notice children, generation to come, um, and in his strength and wondrous works that he has done. So they're telling these words are regarding the praises, his strength, his wondrous works. That's all one term in the Hebrew, but wondrous works. It sounds like a pun. Wondrous works nicely. It actually is a good translation. These are things that God has done. We're going to see that in the psalm, both good things that God has done, and then sometimes judgmental things against both his enemies and against that are supposed to be his people that are acting like his enemies. Can I say it that way? So these are going to be generational. It's a tongue twister. Generational lessons um, for the children and those children that aren't children yet. They're the generations that are coming. For he established a testimony in Jacob. That, remember, that's their generation. That's their history, their family. He has established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law, and this time it's given as again Torah, law versus instruction. I guess you could take it either way. Which he commanded our fathers that they should teach them to their children. Again, we're seeing the generational aspect of this. That the generation to come, so you've got the fathers and their children, and then future children, the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children. So this is supposed to be passed on from father to child to grandchild to great grandchild to as many children eventually come down. These are, can I say, timeless truths because they're to go as long as time remains. That they should put their confidence in God. This is what the teaching consists of. This is the lesson you're supposed to learn, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. and not be like their fathers. What were their fathers like? A stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its heart and whose spirit was not faithful to God. So put confidence in God, but don't walk the way of those who were not faithful to God. Now we have an example of that with this first line of verse 9, the sons of Ephraim. Remember, Ephraim was one of the tribes of Israel. Actually, one of the two sons of Ephraim and Manasseh were two sons of Joseph, so Joseph had gotten a double portion. And the sons of Ephraim were always looked up to as leaders of the 12 tribes. Notice the sons of Ephraim were, and we're going to come back to Ephraim later on, but let's look at this now. They were archers equipped with bows. Remember, an archer was somebody who could shoot somebody at distance. You didn't have to be up in the front lines. Yet they turned back in the day of battle. You know, archers aren't supposed to be turning back. I can see where the people up on the front lines that are having to just fight with spears and swords and hand-to-hand combat, um, they might turn back, but the archers aren't supposed to do that. And so there's a special mention here of the sons of Ephraim and their unfaithfulness. And this reminds us of the words of Hosea, where Hosea chapter 7, beginning chapter 7 and verse 1, Hosea says, when I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim is uncovered, and the evil deeds of Samaria, for they deal falsely. The thief enters in, bandits on the outside, and goes on from there. Notice the false dealings, and here in verse 10 of the Psalm 78, we read about how they did not keep the covenant of God. That's false dealings. When you say you're going to do something, when you vowed to do something, when you've made a covenant and yet you don't keep it and refuse to walk in it. Hosea goes on from there, Hosea chapter 7, but down to verse 8. Ephraim mixes himself with the nations. You see, when you mix yourself with the nations, remember, according to the covenant, they were supposed to keep separate. So they refused to walk in his law. And then the line goes on, Ephraim has become a cake not turned. In other words, it's sort of, can I say it this way, half-baked. Strangers devour his strength, yet he does not know it. Gray hairs are also sprinkled on him, yet he does not know it. You know, he's got problems and doesn't know or has forgotten. Verse 11 here, they forgot his deeds and his miracles that he had shown them. They forgot what God had done. And so not only was he doing the wrong thing, he wasn't even realizing he was doing the wrong thing. Like an old man who has forgotten what he's supposed to do. And the gray hairs are sprinkled upon him, Hosea chapter 7, verse 9 says. Hosea continues, verse 10, though the pride of Israel testifies against him, yet they have not returned to the Lord their God, nor have they sought him for all of this. Hosea is dictating a problem in Israel, but a problem especially in this leading tribe. This has special mention, the sons of Ephraim. Hosea continues down in verse 11. So Ephraim has become like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria. When they go, I will spread my net over them. I will bring them down like birds of the sky. I will chastise them in accordance with the proclamation to their assembly. So the sons of Ephraim are being mentioned here as being a special problem in Israel. Verse 12, he wrought wonders before their fathers. Now, we're not talking just about Ephraim here. We're talking about all of Israel, although Ephraim was a part of that. This is talking about what happened in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. Zoan is one of the cities of Egypt. And it's taking us back to when Israel was in Egypt, and then God brought them out of Egypt in the Exodus event. Verse 13, he divided the sea, this is coming through the Red Sea, and caused them to pass through. And he made the waters stand up like a heap. And then he led them with the cloud by day, this was in the wilderness, and then all the night, notice how you go cloud, and then day, and then night, and then light of fire, sort of a chiastic setup there in verse 14. Um, so he brought them through the Exodus and out into the wilderness. Verse 15, he split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them abundant drink like the ocean depths. Remember the instance, they get into the wilderness, there's no water there. And so Moses instructed, strike the rock and it splits and out comes water. Verse 16, another description of that, he brought forth streams also from the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. And yet, verse 17 is the problem. They still continued to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. And in their heart, they put God to the test by asking food according to their desire. Verse 19, then they spoke against God. And they said, and notice this is all what they're saying in there. They're asking for more. God is providing for them. They said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck the rock so the waters gushed out and streams were overflowing. Can he give bread also? Will he provide meat for his people? And apparently the way they're doing that is not necessarily a good way. You know, it's okay to ask God for things, but they're doing in a way that's showing a rebellious heart and speaking against him. Verse 21, therefore the Lord heard and was full of wrath, and a fire was kindled against Jacob, and an anger also mounted against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust his salvation. You know, you ask, yes, but you also wait for him to answer. And they didn't do that. So the problem here was a problem of unbelief, of not trusting in the goodness of God. Verse 23, yet he commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of heaven, and he rained down manna upon them. This is God's faithful provision, where manna came. Remember what manna was? They looked at it as when it's first described in the book of Exodus. They look at it, and this stuff is on the ground. They say, "What is it?" And that's what they called it. And the way you say "what is it" is manu, and so they called it manna. The what do you call it? He rained down manna upon them to eat, and gave them food from heaven. He had provided it. It wasn't something that grew naturally there. Verse 25, man did eat the bread of angels. Now that we're being poetic, it's not necessarily literal. You know, it's not that, you know, you say, what's on the menu for angels? It's manna. No, we're being poetic here. He sent them food in abundance. And really all you had to do is go out and pick it up, and even gave instructions on that about how much you were to pick up, and you could pick up all you were going to eat, but don't try to save it for the next day because he's going to provide for that day too. And there were very careful instructions about that. Verse 26, he caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he directed the south wind when he rained meat upon them like the dust, even winged fowl. Now, this was a different time. They'd been eating manna for quite some time, and they said, we want to change. We don't like this manna anymore. Of course, without the manna, they would have died in the wilderness, but you can see their heart there. We want meat. And so he sent them meat. He rained meat upon them like dust, even winged fowl, like the sand of the seas. Remember the instance where the wind brings quail to land, and they were literally, at least this is the way it's described, they were hip deep in quail. Verse 28, then he let them fall in the midst of the camp, round about their dwellings. You didn't have to go out and find it like the manna. It came right there in the camp itself. Verse 29, so they ate and were filled, and their desire he gave to them. He gave them exactly what they wanted, but actually what they wanted wasn't God. They wanted this other stuff. Verse 30, before they had satisfied their desire, while their food was in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them and killed some of their stoutest ones, and subdued the choice men of Israel. That was God's judgment. And in spite of this, they still sinned. In spite of this, they did not believe in his wonderful works. So there's a continual pattern of God's faithful provision followed by God's judgment when they don't believe. Verse 33, so he brought their days to an end in futility, and their years in sudden terror. Day after day after day led to year after year. And remember, they wandered in the wilderness all those years. Verse 34, when he killed them, and so you've got the judgment, but then as they were dying, then they sought him, and returned and searched diligently for God. So that, because of the judgment, that caused them to turn. So they have the return, verse 35, and they remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God, their Redeemer. So they remember this about God, that He is their rock, that He is their Redeemer. He is the deliverer who had brought them out of Egypt and who had delivered them ultimately from the wilderness, because that's where we're going next. Verse 36, but they deceived him with their mouth and lied to him with their tongue. They said the right things. Sort of reminds me of Pharaoh, where Pharaoh would, judgment would come, and Pharaoh would say, "That's it, I'll let you go," and then he would harden his heart, and he went back on his word. And they did the same thing. They were acting like Pharaoh had. Verse 37, for their heart was not steadfast toward him, nor were they faithful in his covenant. They weren't keeping the covenant that they had made with God. And so there's an insincere, can I call it loyalty? Because the covenant demands loyalty. There's a term that describes that loyalty. We call it chesed. Sometimes we translate it loving kindness, but I like the term loyalty here. And they were not faithful. They were not loyal. Verse 38, but he being compassionate forgave their iniquity. God didn't have to do that. The penalty for breaking a covenant was death. But instead he forgave, he did not destroy them, and often he restrained his anger and did not arouse all his wrath. And so there was forgiveness heaped on forgiveness. If you want to look for grace, you don't have to wait until the New Testament. You can see it in the Old Testament as well. Verse 39, thus he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and does not return. That's an interesting description, not just of Israel, but of us too. We are but flesh. We're not up to God's standards. We're not up to able to do that which God can do. We're here today and gone tomorrow. And that's true in our mortality. Can I say it this way? It's often true, very oftentimes, in our loyalty. So what's true of our mortality is often also true of our loyalty. Verse 40, how often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. Again and again they tempted God and pained the Holy One of Israel. Verse 42, they did not remember his power, the day when he redeemed them from the adversary. Verse 43, when he performed his signs in Egypt, but now notice how we're doing this. We're going back to Egypt. We've been watching Israel go through the wilderness, but now instead of taking us to the promised land, we go back and recall what he had done, what they had forgotten in the wilderness, about how he performed his signs in Egypt, his marvels in the field of Zoan. Remember, we made reference to that, Egypt and Zoan. Zoan being a town in Egypt. Verse 44, and turned their rivers to blood, some of the things that God did back there, and their streams they could not drink. He sent among them swarms of flies, which devoured them, and frogs. We're not necessarily going in chronological order, but this is just a rehashing, a redescription of what happened in the events leading up to the Exodus in Egypt. Frogs which destroyed them. So these are the plagues of Egypt that we're being reminded of. He also gave their crops to the grasshopper and the product of their labor to the locust. Now, grasshoppers and locusts is sort of the same thing. It was one plague. Verse 47, he destroyed their vines with hailstones, their sycamore trees with frost. Now, it's interesting because I don't recall anything about frost, but that's probably the hailstone plague, because hail is ice, and so to get ice, you've got to get a weather change, a climate change. He gave over their cattle also to hailstones and their herds to bolts of lightning. All seems to be describing that one plague. He sent upon them his burning anger, fury, and indignation and trouble. What are we talking about? We're talking about a band of destroying angels. This is the last plague. This is the plague that during which there was the Passover. This is the plague where the angel of death came through Egypt and any firstborn, and that's what we're going to see here. He leveled a path for his anger. He did not spare their soul from death, but gave over their life to the plague. And here it is, and smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the first issue of their virility in the tents of Ham. Of course, the tents of Ham, that's a reference to Egypt. Ham, remember, was one of the sons of Noah, and from Ham, one of the countries that comes from Ham are the people of Egypt. But he led forth his own people. So you've got the people of Ham, the people that had the plague, but then as a result of that, he led forth his own people like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. So notice we already talked about the Red Sea, but we're going to see it again. He led them safely so that they did not fear, but the sea engulfed their enemies. And so again, you have a retelling. We talked about this already, but now we're seeing it again in this retelling and this flashback and this memory of what God had done in Egypt. And so you have the Exodus event, but now we pass over the wilderness because we already talked about this in the first part of the psalm. So now we're coming to the promised land. So he brought them to his holy land, to this hill country which his right hand had gained. Verse 55, he also drove out the nations before them and appointed them for an inheritance by measurement. So not only did they get into the land, not only did they take the land, there's the last half of the book of Joshua where they're given the inheritance and it's parceled out, it's measured out and described very, very succinctly, and made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. So we finally come to the land in this retelling of the things that God has done. Yet you think, okay, they're finally in the land, everything's going to be good. Yet they tempted and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies. It's one thing to do it in the wilderness. Now they're in the land, and they still did that. Verse 57, but turned back and acted treacherously like their fathers. They turned aside like a treacherous bow. Imagine shooting a bow, and instead you end up shooting yourself. It's not supposed to work that way. Verse 58, for they provoked him with their high places and aroused his jealousy with their graven images. When they got to the land and took the land, actually God gave it to them. They didn't have to do much taking. God gave it to them. And there were people that he was removing from the land that had been idol worshippers. And what did they do? They started picking up some of those same idols and worshiping them. So you've got Israel's unfaithfulness in the land, unfaithfully taking the very idols that had caused the previous inhabitants to be removed and beginning to use them in worship. When God heard, he was filled with wrath and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he abandoned the dwelling places at Shiloh. And here's the judgment. He abandoned the dwelling places, the tent which he had pitched among men. He had come into the land. He had given them a place where the tabernacle was set up, a place called Shiloh, or actually, if you go there today, they call it Shiloh, which is okay, I suppose. It's still a place of worship, not for the Jewish people, but for the Samaritans. Verse 61, and gave up his strength to captivity and his glory into the hand of the adversary. Now, this isn't talking yet about Babylonian captivity. This is just talking about the different captivities as you read through the book of Judges. First there would be one group of people coming in, taking all things, and then another group and another group. And the whole book of Judges is just one group after, Midianites and Canaanites and Philistines and Moabites and Ammon, just all sorts of folks. Verse 62, he also delivered his people to the sword and was filled with wrath at his inheritance. The very land that he had given now became something that suffered the trampling of enemies, and this was all the judgment of God doing this. Verse 63, fire devoured his young men, and his virgins had no wedding songs. His priests fell by the sword, and his widows could not weep. Notice the different folks that are being affected by this judgment that comes on the land. And now we have the turning point, verse 65. Then the Lord awoke as if from a sleep. It's like the sleeper awakens. He, like a warrior overcome by wine, he drove his adversaries backward. That's not saying that God was asleep, but it's as if he had been, where God was there, but all of a sudden he begins to act, and suddenly everything changes, and he put on them an everlasting reproach, not on the people of God, but on the enemies, the adversaries who were driven backward. And so the sleeper awakens. And verse 67, he also rejected the tent of Joseph and did not choose the tribe of Ephraim. Remember how we talked about that? Um, but instead now chose the tribe of Judah. That didn't happen when they first came into the land. That didn't happen in the book of Joshua or Judges. But it does happen after Saul had become king, and remember he was put down, and now a new leader arises. Notice, chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, and this is God's chosen instrument, Mount Zion, which he loved, and he built up his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he had founded forever. And so God chooses a new tribe, but not only a new tribe to be the leader of all the other tribes. Notice he built up a sanctuary like the heights, like the earth, which he has founded forever. In other words, the earth, the earth doesn't come and go all the time. It's sort of here, at least for the time being, it's here to stay. And the sanctuary of God was to be like that. Mount Zion was to be like that. Verse 70, he also chose David, his servant. So now we're getting personal. Remember, Saul was rejected. David was anointed and then became, in 2 Samuel, the new king of initially just the tribe of Judah, but eventually all the tribes of Israel, and took him from the sheepfolds, from the care of the ewes with suckling lambs. He brought him to be a new kind of shepherd, to shepherd Jacob, his people, and Israel, his inheritance. And so we come to the end. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them with his skillful hands. And so we come full circle to see, we start off a call to remember, and we end with the one that God has chosen that is to be here and to lead the people in remembering and being faithful. In closing, let's take a quick review of the entire chapter. We started in verses 1 through 11 with the story of Israel, which has a purpose and has to be passed on to future generations. That was something of an introduction, a very lengthy introduction. And then verses 12 through 41, we saw Israel in the wilderness as she continued to sin, being faithless to the covenant, but God continued to forgive. Yes, there was judgment during that period, but God didn't kill them all in the wilderness. That generation died, but there was a continuing influx of new people, a continuing remnant. Verses 42 through 53, we see that Israel had forgotten the power of God in delivering them from Egypt. We had a flashback to Egypt in those verses, where his mighty hand was seen in delivering them. And then we went from there to the promised land, verses 54 through 64, where Israel came into the land, but even there continued a pattern of rebellion against God, suffering the results of that rebellion. And finally, we came to verses 65 through 72, where we had the sleeper awakens. The Lord, he wasn't really asleep, but he awakes. Suddenly he's acting, rejecting Ephraim, but choosing David, and then building his sanctuary on Mount Zion. Now, what does that mean to us? You see, as we look at the overview of their story, that failure and God's continual faithfulness, that's our story too, because we have a Savior who acted to save us, not because of our success, not because of our faithfulness, but in spite of it, where he was faithful on our behalf, so that we, through faith in him, and faith was seen all throughout the Old Testament story, but we, through faith in him, can enter into, can I call it this way, our promised land, so that we can be with him, not to build a temple, but we are being built as a temple, as we follow our greater David.